Hello, everyone, and welcome to another full-length podcast. Just a few announcements before we start. I'm going to be doing a video with some other people on the Ukraine crisis going on right now, the Ukrainian-Russian war. That should be out maybe in a couple of months, just so we can research it and really get to know what's going on. Apart from that, we're moving the gaming podcast to Thursdays instead of Mondays, although the next one will be released tomorrow, hopefully, just because we've been having technical issues with those. Yeah, and finally, yeah, this episode is going to be a real banger. It's going to be, I'm really excited. We're going to learn about hylomorphism in philosophy. We're going to look at Book 4, Plato's Republic, which is the center of the whole book, and we're going to look at my own original argument concerning what we can take out of Aristotle's economics. All right, so let's kick it off with the philosophy section. And as always, as usual, we'll start with a review of last week's material and then go on to discuss form and matter. All right, so in the last podcast, we examined Heracletus's dynamic monism, which argues that there is nothing permanent in reality, but only becoming or constant changing. In Aristotelian jargon, we saw that this idea is the equivalent of rejecting act, but not potency. To refute this argument, we saw that it is impossible for potency to modify something that doesn't exist already, since potency presupposes some sort of existence. Armed with these arguments, we were able to finally return to the first Thomistic thesis and examine it, which said, potency and act so divide being that whatsoever exists is either pure act or a mixture of potency and act as to its primordial and intrinsic principles. And I would recommend going back to that podcast if you didn't understand a single word of what I just said. I'd recommend going back to the last philosophy podcast to see how I laid it out there. All right, so having defined potency as the capacity for certain change and act as that which exists and is modified by potency, we can see that whatever exists must be either pure act or a mixture of potency and act. And again, I'm throwing all these technical terms around. We examined these in more depth in prior philosophical episodes. So yeah, feel free to browse through some of those if you're still a little confused on what those are. All right, so I'll repeat what I just said. Having defined potency as the capacity for certain change and act as the existence which makes possible that potency, which brings into existence that potency, we can see that whatever exists must be either pure act or a mixture of potency and act. Okay, why don't they say pure potency? You have act and potency, you have act and the combination of act and potency, but not potency. Now, why is that? Why isn't pure potency, a real feature of the world? Well, with apologies to Heracletus, pure potency is not possible, as we saw earlier in the previous podcast, since potency requires something to inhere on. Finally, primordial principles simply refer to the most basic causes of a thing, of which the most basic is a thing's existence. After all, without a thing's existence, there's nothing that could modify it if it doesn't exist. While intrinsic principles refer to those causes that modify an existing thing, a cause which is simply potency. Okay, so hopefully that cleared up, that reinforced the last episode. And now, armed with knowledge concerning potency and act, we are now ready to start moving towards the deep end. Yeah, we are going to depart from Parmenides, Zeno, and Heraclitus, who were the three main, well, not Aristotle, but those three who were the three main antagonists, as I suppose, from our first three philosophy podcasts. And we're going to move on to considering form and matter and the second Thomistic thesis. So the second thesis is beginning quote, act, because it is perfection, is not limited except by potency, which is capacity for perfection. Therefore, in the order in which the act is pure, it is unlimited and unique, but in that in which it is finite and manifold, it comes into a true composition with potency. Now, this sounds like, a load of baloney, basically. Like, what does that even mean? Well, it sounds complicated, but we're just going to take, we're going to take it bit by bit, and hopefully by zooming in on certain parts of this thesis, we can gradually grasp the whole of it. So for this episode, it's going to be a bit of a shorter one, but we're going to be looking at potency. We're going to be looking at the last part of the second Thomistic thesis, which is that act, or in that in which act is finite and manifold, it comes into a true composition with potency. So let me repeat that. In that in which act is finite and manifold, it comes into a true composition with potency. So you have act and potency, and there's a composition of them. They're in the same thing. This is what, this is essentially the theory of hylomorphism that we're going to get into. Okay, so the first question to ask in relation to this last part of the second Thomistic thesis is how act and potency combine to determine objects in the world. What does it mean when you say act and potency are composed, or there's what do you mean when you say a composition of act and potency? Well, enter Aristotle's idea of hylomorphism. Suppose you were to draw something on a dry erase board. Once the ink from that pen dries on the board, the ink is no longer in liquid form. If it were to be erased, it would then turn into smaller particles, but still with the same matter as it had before you drew anything on the board. Thus, this matter persists through changes, while the form it takes on varies depending on what acts upon the ink. In extremely technical jargon, yeah, you know what? Actually, before I get into that, let me just back up and review that last part again. So you have the ink in the pen, you write it on the dry erase board, and then that ink dries. It's no longer like ink per se; it's dried ink. And then if you come along and take a cleaner or whatever, yeah, wiping the dry erase board dry, then the dry ink becomes particles of dried ink. So liquid ink, dry ink, and particles are all separate things, separate objects, but the same matter is underlying all of those. So that is what. So I'm going to introduce this technical jargon, but that's what we mean when we say a substratum of a substratum underlying potencies in question. You can't say ink because ink only refers to the first one. So we have to define this thing substratum to capture the idea that it is really the same material, even though the objects are different. It is really the same material in the liquid ink and the dry ink and the particles that come after the dried ink is wiped off. So we introduce this concept of substratum, where the material is all the same, but the form is not. And we're going to get into form as we go along here. So in extremely technical jargon, the ink is the determinable substratum which underlies the potentialities in question, while the determinable patterns that the substratum takes on are what exist after the actualization of the potentialities in the substratum have taken place. So that was really complicated. The second thing to understand here is, what do we mean by determinable patterns? So we looked at substratum. That is the underlying material going through every single stage. But what about determinable substratum? Determinable pattern. What does that mean? Well, it just means that once the potentials are actualized in the ink, so the ink has a potential to become a dry ink. So once that potency is actualized, and this ink turns into a dry ink, then what exists is a different pattern. So we could say a different determinable pattern than what existed before. The first one was ink, and now the determinable form has transformed into dry ink. Yeah, I don't know if I explained that well, but yeah, the so you have the substratum, which goes underneath. That's the matter, and then you have um, the determinable patterns up above, actualizing the potentialities that the substratum has at each stage. Okay, and as Phaser puts it, um, much more much better than I do. This is his beginning quote. Matter is essentially that which needs actualizing in change. Form is essentially that which results from the actualization. So matter is the substratum, the thing that is waiting to be acted upon, but does not, the potency that is waiting to come out to exist, but does not exist yet, or does not fully exist yet. Whereas the actualization is uh, the determinable pattern, the way in which that ink is built. Basically, it's that determinable pattern um, is that actualizes these potentialities that the substratum has. Um, okay, hopefully you guys are still awake at this point, but let's keep charging through here. Okay, we also see this as a result of universals like triangularity. Triangularity as a concept is perfect, while the triangles we see in reality are only triangular imperfectly. Thus, there must be some perfect form for triangles, i.e., triangularity, and something which approximates triangularity imperfectly. Finally, there must be something by which triangularity exists in this particular time and space. So triangularity is a general concept. It doesn't, you can't like, you know, you can't like write it in a specific time and place and say that that's what triangularity is, because you're never going to be able to draw an actual triangle. And triangularity as a concept just doesn't exist, or doesn't exist in reality. Like it's not there's no material aspect to it. um, so, roughly speaking, being triangular can be said to be a way of being actual, whereas being only imperfectly triangular is a way of being potential. Thus, a triangle which is drawn is actual to the extent that it approximates triangularity. So, if you're drawing a triangle, that's more or less actual depending on how well you draw it. If you draw it with like really wavy lines, that's going to be, that the form enabling that is going to be way more imperfect. Whereas if you have it on a computer or something, it's going to be almost exact. All right. So both this explanation and the division between act and potency now give us a better understanding of matter and form. So the division between matter and form is actually analogous to that between potency and act. Um, Matter corresponds to potentiality, so that was the substratum that persists underneath as the ink changes from liquid ink to dry ink to particles, and then the form is related to actuality. So that is the determinable patterns acting upon the substratum to bring their potencies into being, into a different form, such as um, dry ink liquid ink turning into dry ink. Um, as Phaser puts it, again, better than I could, beginning quote, matter is passive and indeterminate, form active and determining. The same bit of matter can take on different forms, and the same form can be received in different bits of matter. Hence, matter and form are as distinct as potentiality and actuality. Still, just as potentiality is grounded in actuality, so too does matter always have some form or another. If matter lacked all form, it would be nothing but the pure potentiality for receiving form and fit and for receiving form and let me back up. I'm kind of stuttering here. If matter lacked all form, it would be nothing but the pure potentiality for receiving form. There would be no actuality to ground it, and it wouldn't exist at all. So remember how we had when we're looking at the first Thomistic thesis in the recap, we had act and potency, and then the combination of act and potency. Well, it's the same thing here again. Matter can matter can exist without some sort of form. So if you imagine form as act, and then matter as potency, then there's the combination of the two. There is just form, but there's no just matter, because there wouldn't be anything for that to do here. And again, we went over this ad nauseum when we looked at Heracletus. So yeah, all these ideas kind of build on each other, which is really cool. So everything, therefore, everything that is composed of form and matter is also composed of actuality and potency, but not everything composed of actuality and potency is also composed of form and matter, such as spiritual beings or God. So form and matter are basically a special case of potentiality and actuality, applying to real sensible things. So if you're talking about something that only has a form but no matter, then that would fall outside the sphere of that would fall outside the sphere of influence of of form and matter. Whereas actuality and potency cover all things that exist. All right. In conclusion, then, we saw that matter is essentially that which needs change to come into being, whereas form is that which results from the actualization of potentials latent in matter. Besides this argument from the perspective of change, we also examined another argument, including universals such as triangularity, for the division of form and matter. To the extent that a thing approximates triangularity, it is said to be more or less perfect, where triangularity is the form, and whatever instantiates the triangularity is said to be the matter. Finally, the division between matter and form is a special case of the division between actualization and potential, referring solely to the real observable world. All right, well, that about does it for the philosophy section. Bit of a shorter one this time. Let's turn it over to politics.